This is a production of Cornell University.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here, if in voice only. And what I'd like to do today is talk to you a little bit about USDA blueberry breeding, both here in the Northeast and around the country. There's a lot to talk about, so we'll begin our whirlwind tour. The first thing I'd like to talk about are the USDA blueberry breeding sites. There are 3 of them. Chatsworth, New Jersey, where I work, doing breeding primarily for the Northeast, but also doing a little bit of breeding of all different kinds. Poplarville, that does breeding primarily for the southern regions, and Corvallis, which does berry breeding of all sorts, blueberries, caneberries, strawberries. Now, the other point I'd like to make with this slide is that in this day and age, if you look around the country and around the world, there are at least 29 other public and private breeding programs worldwide. And the one point I'd like to make, particularly about the materials being produced by these, is that at least for the USDA at this point in time, all the materials produced are public domain. There are some exceptions, specialty cultivars may or may not be patented, but they are public domain, and I think this is important because it means that these cultivars are readily available to everyone. They can be propagated readily, and they can be sold readily. If you look at both private programs and other public programs, they often have patented cultivars, and in some cases they're proprietary and club cultivars, meaning that cultivars are not available to everyone everywhere. What I'd like to look at with this slide are traits of importance to breeders. Now, this was a survey that was done in 2014. And if we look at this, we can see that some of the traits are seasonality, some of them are traits of importance to growers, some of them are traits of importance to consumers. But amongst them, what is rated highest is productivity. And if you look to the right of the slide, in most cases, machine harvestability, particularly in this day and age, is considered a critical factor. Now, beyond this, breeders select for many, many more things. Things such as vigor, time of bloom, bush stature, self-fertility. So a breeder going out into the field has to select for many, many factors, some of them tangible, some of them intangible, which takes us to our next slide. Marker-assisted selection using molecular markers is a strategy being employed in every major crop today. The USDA has engaged a group at Cornell to do the same thing for several minor crops, including blueberry. And what this will ultimately do is allow us to predict the traits and performance of an individual before it's ever grown in the field. I'm not a molecular biologist, but the basic process of marker-assisted selection is not difficult to understand. In the development process, we need to determine the traits of interest. We then need to find a segregating test population that will be evaluated for those traits of interest, and concurrently begin molecular marker discovery. For the plants that are put into the field, each individual is scored for each trait in multiple years. And ultimately, a correlation is made of the molecular markers that are discovered and the traits that are tabulated for each individual. When put into practice, whole populations can be screened and individuals selected based upon the markers that they express, or as is being done nowadays in limited cases, in many, many crops, is the selection of optimized parents. If you have optimized parents, you can produce an improved population more readily than unoptimized parents. What this allows you to do, it allows you to leverage your effort But in all these cases, the plants are still going to need field testing. Now, when you look at molecular marker-assisted selection, it is especially good for complex traits where the inheritance is not simple and not easily traced. And it's also very good for traits with sporadic expression or with genotype by environment interactions. Once again, in any case, it should save considerable time, effort, and cost. Now I'd like to move to conventional blueberry breeding. The USDA has produced cultivars over the years that have been the backbone of the blueberry industry, and the USDA continues to produce cultivars for many needs in many areas. What I'd like to highlight here is a recent release of ours from last year, Talisman. This is a northern highbush blueberry variety, basically in a Jersey season. If you look at it and think it looks like a beautiful bush, that is what Talisman looks like when it grows. This is a 5-year-old bush of Talisman. I won't talk a lot about it here, but I would refer you to contact me if you want more information on it. It's also been written up in several different places, and you can certainly find it on the internet. To highlight a few further varieties, Biloxi is a variety that was released in 1998 and a public domain variety. It has become a widely grown variety in areas where no chill southern highbush are needed. Mini Blues is a processing variety, and again, it's a specialty variety. It's a patented variety. It was released in 2017. It's a high quality fruit with outstanding flavor and is as productive as blue crop, but only half the size of the fruit. Pink Lemonade is a specialty variety we released in 2007. This is also public domain. Pink Lemonade is a rabbit eye derived type variety, so it's a little more southern adapted, but it is the most successful pink fruited cultivar that's been released so far. And in terms of looking at specialty cultivars, it has a unique, mild, flowery flavor. We continue to work on pink varieties, and I think they will produce or find a larger niche in the future. Now, in the last slide, I casually mentioned rabbit eye. My predecessor, when I started working, suggested that we try to incorporate more rabbit eye for northern areas. And I took his comment to heart. One of the great things about rabbit eye that always interested me is the great vigor of rabbit eye. What you can see on the left-hand picture is rabbit eye seedlings and highbush seedlings out in the field. These are young plants that are about 2 years old. And the rabbit eye seedlings are about twice as tall as the highbush seedlings. Rabbit eye has the potential to get very, very large if it grows under ideal conditions, but it does have a lot of cons. It's not cold hardy, it's late ripening, and it needs cross-pollination. So one of the things we did over the years was mix rabbit eye with some northern germplasm. And my goal was to produce a blue-fruited variety for the north that might be a little bit late ripening. And we partway succeeded. We produced a variety called Nocturne. It has dark fruit, but we did achieve cold hardiness. We did achieve self-fertility, and we maintained a lot of the vigor. Now, Nocturne became a patented variety for us as a specialty ornamental and landscape type plant. But one of the important things to see, particularly about Nocturne, is the cold hardiness that we achieved in this material. If you look at the graph, what you can see, this is a plot of cold hardiness of several different kinds of cultivars. Legacy is a southern highbush, Tiff Blue is a rabbit eye, Blue Crop is northern highbush. By December 20th, if you look at cold hardiness, the cold hardiness of southern highbush and rabbit eye types begin to decline and move towards warmer and warmer temperatures. Northern highbush, such as blue crop, after December 20th, maintains a sort of a steady state of dormancy for about another 3 or 4 weeks before it begins to lose dormancy. And because of the things we mixed with rabbit eye in producing nocturne, we have produced a rabbit eye type plant that stays dormant and cold hardy, nearly as cold hardy as northern highbush, for the same amount of time, and doesn't begin to deacclimate until about the 7th of February. So in an ongoing project to try and produce northern adapted rabbit eye derived plants, we have parents that are nocturne by Duke and nocturne by Elliott, which we have in the field as vigorous plants. And we have crossed those to both highbush plants, Elliott and Duke in this particular case, as well as blue fruited rabbit eye types, powder blue, a couple of numbered selections, and also to nocturne again as well. And we currently have populations out in the field that we will be evaluating this summer for both their growth, their productivity, their color, and their fruit quality. And I hope, I have some high expectations for these materials, and we'll find out what particular sorts of combinations work out best in producing a commercial product. And as my last topic, I'd like to talk a little bit about some new germplasm we've been working to incorporate with highbush blueberry. And that's a species called the Andean blueberry from South America, also known as Vaccinium meridionale. And the question is, what does it bring to the party? Why did we start using it? What you see there is a picture of Vaccinium meridionale in its native habitat. It brings a very dense floral structure with a high flower number. It has a relatively uniform and concentrated blooming period, which is something you'd want for machine harvesting. Monopodial, also good for machine harvesting. A tree-like structure, vigor. Also high antioxidants. Very much pigment in the skin. Possibilities of internal pigmentation. Cold hardiness, perhaps, some high altitude adaptation. Overall, a vigorous and interesting plant and highly fertile, also tetraploid, so potentially compatible with highbush blueberry. In this picture, we see the fruit of the Andean blueberry in the upper photo. In the center photo and the right-hand photo, we see both the dense flower structure and the tall, upright, vigorous quality that's inherited in the F1s. And by the time we get to a backcross one, which is 3/4 highbush, we've recovered blue fruit and pretty decent sized fruit as well. So this is actually a very successful cross overall in terms of germplasm incorporation, and has a lot of potential for future development of blueberry varieties. And so we were able, with relative ease, to cross the tetraploid Andean blueberry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just going to start again. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, play from current slide. Nice.
And so we were able, with
Perfect.
relative ease, to cross the tetraploid Andean blueberry with tetraploid highbush blueberry and produce vigorous, fertile, and productive hybrids. What we also discovered along the way was that we could cross the Andean blueberry with both cranberry and lingonberry as well. And this really is a project that I've dabbled with on the edges for many, many years. And it's an aspiration that really has turned into a reality. And once you know that you can do this, it's easy when you think about the various Vaccinium crops, traits in one crop or the other that would be useful if they could be moved into one of the other crops. This slide summarizes our current progress on crossing meridionally with the other Vaccinium species. Any place you see a picture, we've succeeded in making the cross. If the box is shaded or blank, it's a cross that is either in the works or still needs to be done. But what I'd like to emphasize about this is that not only have we been able to make these crosses, if they're made between plants that are both at the same ploidy level, we can generate many hybrids, not just a few hybrids, but hundreds of hybrids fairly easily. And in all the cases we've looked at so far, the initial hybrids have been quite fertile. Back crosses to the species are a mixed bag, sort of. Some are somewhat difficult, some are more difficult than others. All the crosses to lingonberry are crosses between a tetraploid and a diploid, which is not a naturally easy cross. You normally want to be crossing at a same ploidy level. But what I can say is this: once you get beyond that first generation and into the second generation, you can then begin permuting these crosses any which way and crossing sort of sideways amongst these different hybrids. And I think this really has the potential not only to improve or allow the transfer of traits among these different crops, but also to potentially produce new crops. Think of things like apriums and pluots, which are hybrids of apricots and plums. This may not be any different. So with that, I'd like to close. If anyone has any questions about any of these materials, feel free to contact me at either the email listed or the phone number listed. I can give you much more information about new and upcoming varieties if you're interested. I'd also recommend, if you haven't seen it and want to know more about blueberries and the blueberry industry, the US Highbush Blueberry Council has a weekly podcast called The Business of Blueberries. Its web address is listed there. Tune in, it's a good thing. Thank you very much, and I'll be available for questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark. What a thrilling and exciting presentation. My jaw was just dropping when you said that about the possibility to cross blueberries with so many other Vaccinium crops. That's so incredible. And so we have a couple questions, and I believe we have a little bit of time to answer them.
Sure.
Thank you. Laura is asking about Southern highbush and their ability to do quite well in northern hardiness zones down to zone 4. There are a number of growers succeeding with a few Southern highbushes in Laura's service area. And she's wondering if you have any comments on that.
Well, you know, it'd be interesting for me to know exactly what varieties they're using, because there are some of the Southern highbush that have more hardiness than others. And even if we look at newer releases of Northern highbush, a lot of them have small bits of germplasm from that are as Southern in ancestry. What I've always believed, and I'm pretty sure if you go back to the one graph I had about rabbit eye in there, is that for anything that's Southern, the wintertime cold hardiness is not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is them emerging from dormancy too early and flowering too early. So among things that have Southern highbush in their background, if they are relatively slow to break dormancy and slow to flower, there's potential for them to do well. If there's something that blooms earlier, and that's the case with many of the Southern highbush that you bring up to this area, they are much more likely to get injured, at least in some years where we might have late freezes. Of course, things are getting warmer over the winters, so you know, the answer is some might do well, others not so much. It depends on where you are and what the relative winter is like.
Thank you. And Tony Emmy has added that he's growing Blue Crop, Blu-ray, and Patriot at his farm just below Lake Ontario in New York.
Well, those are all northern highbush and quite hardy.
Sound like good choices for that area. And so folks, I think y'all should keep writing your questions into the chat. And Mark, would you be okay to stay on and maybe answer any other questions that
Oh, absolutely. I can hang on as long as needed later on.
Thank you so much. It's so good to have you here. And now we're going to have our next speaker, who is Thierry Besançon, sorry. And he will be speaking to us about weeds. So Dr. Thierry Besançon is an extension specialist in weed science. He works with specialty crops, and he works at the Philip E. Marucci Center for Blueberry and Cranberry Research and Extension in New Jersey. So one of his many projects is examining alternative weed management strategies that may help reduce the potential for herbicide resistance in specialty crops. And without further ado, I am inviting Dr. Besançon to share his screen.
Good morning, everyone. So thanks, Anya, for the introduction. I'm a colleague of Mark Ehlenfeldt, who just talked before. We're working at the same research station in the pine lands of New Jersey. And I'm working on weed science in so many different crops. But today we'll be focusing on blueberry, on highbush blueberry.
Yes, it's better. Thank you.
Yeah, so in New Jersey, I mean, New Jersey is basically the home of two Vaccinium species. One is northern highbush blueberry, which has been developed at the beginning of the 20th century in New Jersey by Elizabeth Coleman White. And we are also the home of another Vaccinium species, which is large cranberry. New Jersey is ranking 6th for blueberry production nationally, on 3rd for cranberry production. So we're really focused on Vaccinium species in New Jersey. So in our state, modern blueberry cropping is really conducted on sandy soil. So our soils are extremely sandy. I would say at least 85% sand. Most of the soil are over 95% sand content. Many situations we have relatively low to moderate organic matter, and we are really observing a depletion issue over the years. And I will come back later why is that the case. Our blueberries are planted on hill. Most of the growers have switched to drip tape irrigation, which may be good for disease management, but it's not so good for weed management. And I can explain that a little bit later. Most of the growers are using cultivation for maintaining weed-free row meadows. We have very few growers using cover crops or sod between the rows. On the hill are really maintained with either herbicide or mulch for weed management. So berries are blueberry are very sensitive to weed competition. And one of the reasons is that you really have an open soil. You have a lot of light, especially in newly planted field. You have continuous irrigation, which was a problem that I was mentioning before. With drip tape irrigation, you're providing a constant flow of water, which is extremely important for stimulating the germination of weeds, as well as forcing the herbicide that you may be using to run off, on pushing the herbicide deeper in the ground where it may not be effective at preventing seeds to germinate or to emerge. So this condition will facilitate the development of weed as much as a crop. On the picture before, it's an organic field, and you can see the magnitude of weed issues that we may have in some of our field here in New Jersey. So these days, we're really relying on integrated weed management for managing weeds, and that's really the combination of multiple methods and practice for managing weeds. So you're trying to combine prevention. I mean, everything is based on prevention. We'll spend some time today really discussing prevention for weed management, but we are trying to combine cultural, mechanical, and chemical approach for really optimizing our weed management. And there is good reason why we do that. You may have heard of the rapid spread of herbicide resistance, not only in agronomic crop, but also in specialty crops, including blueberry. So when you have these herbicide resistant weeds, obviously you need to have other tactics for controlling them. You may have new species entering the field that will require tactics different than just using herbicides, and you have an increased societal demand for less herbicide used in crop production. So the basics, I said it, but the basics is really prevention. And to do that, even before starting to plant your, before working your blueberry field, when you're at the stage of planning your plantation, you need to really think to what you will be doing, especially with regard to weed management. So you need to start clean and you need to stay clean. So for berries and other perennial crops, you really need to be carefully choosing the sites where you will be planting your blueberry field. You want to avoid as much as possible, and it's not always possible, I am well aware of that, but you want to avoid as much as possible any field where you have problematic perennial species, such as bindweed, Canada thistle, goldenrod, eventually nutsedge. Because, I mean, if you really don't want to have problem with these weeds later during your production cycle, you need to be able to manage them really aggressively before planting, because you really have very few options that will be effective at controlling this kind of weeds when your field will be in production. So one option is really to use cultivation ahead of time before planting your blueberry. On that, really, I mean, the principle behind cultivation is that you really want to force the weed to exhaust any energy which is stored in the underground parts, in the rhizome, in the roots. And by doing that, and by preventing the weed to grow, you may really force the weed to exhaust all the energy stored in the underground storage parts. If you want to do that, you need to really cultivate every 7 to 14 days. Any gap, if you're missing any cultivation, that will provide sufficient time for the weed to grow and to replenish nutrients back to the roots. So basically, you will be back at you will be back to the beginning of your cultivation, because you will not have made any progress. Intense soil disturbance can be problematic with respect to soil structure, soil health, and the potential for erosions. And as I mentioned, infrequent disturbance can result in root and rhizome fragments on bulbs being spread throughout the field and become reestablished. That's especially the case with species like Canada thistle that can really reroot themselves easily if you're just fragmenting the rhizome, which is what you're doing when you're doing cultivation. So another option is really to try to use some systemic post-emergence herbicide that can really help you controlling some of these perennial species. So the two main herbicides that we're using for that, for preparing the field, first one is glyphosate, and we can also use 2,4-D. With this herbicide, the best application timing is really when the plants are in bud of flowers. And for most of these species, you will have to renew the herbicide application in fall before frost for maximizing the amount of herbicide that can be sent back to the rhizome of these perennial plants. As I mentioned, you really want to plan ahead of time, at least 2 years, because some of these perennial weed, it will take at least 2-3 years if you really want to achieve success in controlling these weeds. And you have to be aware that some perennial weeds, for example, yellow nutsedge, will not be effectively controlled. Even glyphosate, if you look at the graph on the right side, even glyphosate is not considered an optimal herbicide for controlling nutsedge. It may have some effect, but definitely you will not prevent tuber production with glyphosate. On 2,4-D has absolutely no effect on yellow nutsedge. So some of these perennial, you may have to deal with them later during the cropping cycle of your blueberries, but it's really hard to control them before planting the field. You need to be aware that as humans, we are moving a lot of weeds in and out of production environments. So through equipment that we are using, or in some situation when we are introducing weeds with mulch. In our situation at the station, we have some field where we use cranberry leaf mulch, and we introduce a specific weed of cranberry bugs, which is Carolina redwood. And we know it came with a mulch. So preventing weeds from dispersing is a critical integrated weed management practice. So really cleaning equipment when you're moving equipment between fields is especially critical, especially if you have herbicide-resistant weeds. You want to make sure that you're not introducing them to fields that are free of herbicide-resistant weeds. You need to make sure that you're sourcing weed-free mulch or compost natural mulches. If you're using cover crop, you need to make sure that your cover crop seeds are free of weed seeds. And a good technique is also making sure that you're not just controlling the weeds within the field, but pay attention to what's going on around the field. Clearly, if you have a situation where you have a lot of perennial weeds or other type of weeds around your blueberry field, that may be a perfect situation for getting some seeds moving into your field later. So try to control these weeds around the field as well. Know your enemy. The really weed identification, it's also a critical part of integrated weed management, and it's essential for developing a successful management plan. One of the reasons for that is that not all herbicides are equal. Some herbicides will work really well on some species while not working on some other species. The life cycle and growth stage of a weed will largely determine optimum timing of control measures. So for a quick example, if you're looking at grasses, if you have annual grasses like large crabgrass, the best time to really control this one, either mechanically or with herbicide, is really to target annual grasses when they are young and actively growing. Now, if you're dealing with scraggrass, which is a perennial grass, this one, the best strategy is really to deplete food reserve in underground vegetative structures. So that's what we're trying to target. A different website that I've been listing here, and I think the presentation will be available for you. So a few websites where you can have help identifying weeds. Something that we're still using and that should be updated this year is a Weeds of the Northeast guide. It's a Cornell guide on Tony Di Tommaso at Cornell is in the process of working on a new version of the guide because we have new weeds that came in the Northeast region, but the guide right now is still available on the Cornell website. The last thing that you can really do as well is if you have a phone, there is two apps, iNaturalist on PlantNet, that can be used for helping you with recognition, identification of weeds in the field. So basically, both apps are using a recognition software to compare your picture to image galleries and provide you with an identification. A few recommendations on how to use these apps. They're relying on unique morphological characteristics on flowers, so that will improve your chance of identifying the weeds. If you can really have flowers or have very specific features like the leaf shape or things like that that are really clear on your picture. You need to make sure that your pictures are clear and minimize background, and you need to submit multiple pictures for really getting a positive identification. One caveat is that I will say that even if you have a clear identification, if you have time, try to double check your weed ID with reputable source. Talk to your county extension agents to make sure that you really identified weeds properly. Detecting weeds, that's another really important part of any weed management program. Just want to remind you that the relative emergence of various weed species is spreading throughout the season. You have some weed species that will emerge in fall. Horseweed, for example, is a good case. When we have mild winter, horseweed will keep emerging and keep growing during the winter. In what we are considering as summer annual weed, we have some species that may really start emerging relatively early in the season. Lamb's quarter is a good example of a weed that will start emerging probably in late March, early April in New Jersey. and you have some other species such as fall panicum, crabgrass, or even goosegrass that will be mostly considered as late spring, early summer emerging weeds. So you have to keep in mind that, yes, I mean, you have all these weed species, and if you have a dominant weed species in your field, knowing what time this weed is emerging is really a good strategy for optimizing your management tactics, either using mechanical control or using herbicides. So when we are scouting for weeds, usually we are doing 2 to 3 stops per acre. We are working along 30 feet of row to look for the weeds. We're trying to spread out the sampling area for getting a really representative map of the weed infestation. And at each stop, we are looking at what are the weed species, what are the stage of development, and what is the density of the weed species. We are not counting them. Is it just low, moderate, or really high density of weed species? Be mindful that in some situation, you may have clustering area in your field. You may have condition, in the field that will stimulate the development of a specific weed species. And try always to bring a camera with you for really confirming identification later. So now that you did this work of finding the weed, identifying the weed, what can we do? So I will start with mechanical weed control and discuss some of the options that are available to us. The first one is really using some organic raw mulch. So it's we're using mostly pine bark in New Jersey. So this mulch will really help with preventing the emergence of annual weeds, not so much with perennial weeds. It's really hard to stop nutsedge to grow, even if you're putting a 5 or 6 inches layer of pine bark mulch. They're really helpful with moisture retention and prevention of soil erosion. In our situation in New Jersey, they're also helpful because they allow us to increase organic matter content over time. Now, one of the problems that we have with some of these mulch is that because they have such a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, they may be responsible for suppression of crop growth, because when you're applying fertilizer, when you're applying nitrogen fertilizer, basically the mulch will absorb the fertilizer to rebalance basically the carbon nitrogen ratio on start of the degradation process of the mulch. So the nitrogen will be bind up to the mulch and will not be available for your crops. So you, in some situation where you really need, if you do that, you really need to bump your rate of fertilizer to compensate for whatever will be tied up to the mulch. This type of mulch are costly, and in some situations they can harbor weed seed based on potentially harmful disease as well. So, I mean, some of the questions that I got many times here in New Jersey is that, how do you use herbicide on organic mulch? So really organic mulch are complicating the use of herbicide because the mulch will absorb most of the herbicide. So pre-emergence herbicide rate should be increased to maximum labor rate for soil with high organic matter content. You need, I mean, you will have some herbicide, I mean, you have some perennial weeds that will still emerge through the mulch, as I mentioned earlier. And if you really want to be efficient at controlling some of these perennial weeds, you really need to use higher pre-emergence herbicide for compensating, for making sure some herbicide will reach the ground. A thick organic mulch will suppress weeds emergence from under the mulch, mostly for annual weed species. One of the issues that you may have with organic mulch is that annual weeds rooting in the surface of decomposed mulch are the major problem. So when the mulch is starting to decompose, it starts to make a really proper, like a potting mix, if you want, for weeds to germinate. And as I mentioned, organic mulch is definitely not an option for controlling nutsedge, which is a major problem for us here in New Jersey. And I will show you a few pictures later. Plastic mulch, that's not really used here in New Jersey. We have just a few growers who use it. It's same thing. It's good for moisture retention. It's really good for soil warming. It can prevent some weed emergence. Again, not for yellow nutsedge. Yellow nutsedge can easily pierce through the plastic mulch. But the problem is that it can be expensive to purchase, lay and dispose of, and some people may have issue with the production and disposal of plastics. Cultivation, raw middle, which is what we are doing a lot here in New Jersey, and we are trying to change that, but it has been difficult mostly because we have sandy acidic soil here in New Jersey, which are not really proper for developing cover crop or sod crop. We're working on that. We have a program starting this year looking at finding the proper sod that can be really used for planting between the rows. So cultivation is great for improving water penetration and increase soil oxygen level. It can really help by eliminating small weed seedlings. One of the major issues that we have right now in New Jersey is that repeated cultivation will contribute to decrease organic matter through oxidation. It will contribute to destroying the soil structure. And that's one of the reasons why here in New Jersey, we came from maybe 4 or 5% organic matter 30, 40 years ago to less than 2% organic matter these days. And it starts to be a major issue. Also because when you have lower organic matter content, that will stimulate root sensitivity to soil-borne disease. So that's something that's a critical issue that we have these days in New Jersey. On-weeding is still done in some situation, mostly in organic blueberry field, but we don't have many of them here in New Jersey. In that situation, I mean, on-weeding with owing, it's mostly done because you don't have mechanical tools that can effectively control within the row. It's good for controlling between the row, but within the row, since you have a hill, it's really hard to get a good mechanical control. So people will send crew of people for owing on the hill. And one of the problems that we observe with that is that if people are not careful, they can easily start unrooting the blueberry plant, exposing the roots and creating a lot of issues with that. Suppressing weed chemically, and that will be my last section for today. So we have different herbicides. We are classifying them in many different ways. One way is to look at where are you applying the herbicide. So you have soil applied versus foliar applied herbicide. You have herbicides that are applied prior to weed emergence, what we are calling the pre's, and we have herbicides that are applied after weed emergence, what we are calling the post-emergence, the post-herbicide. You can also look at what kind of weed are they controlling. So they can be broad spectrum, or they can be narrow spectrum. They can be selective, or they can be, for some herbicide, non-selective herbicide. So we'll start with using really the pre-emergence soil-applied herbicide on a few. I like to remind that because it's so easy to skip that, and it's really important to make sure that these herbicides are functioning properly. So these herbicides need to apply in fall or spring before bud break, and it's critical, and I will show you a little bit later why. These herbicides will remain active in the soil for weeks or months. Not all herbicides are equally safe on berries, and some of them are only designated for non-bearing plants. What is really critical is that you need to start clean. If you have any kind of residues of weeds on the soil surface, that will act really as a screen for preventing this pre-emergence herbicide to get into the ground. They need to be into the ground. They need to be moving into the first few inches of soil to be really efficient. If you have any residue at the soil surface, that will reduce your herbicide effectiveness. You need to make sure that you're adjusting the rate to soil type and organic matter. Spray coverage is critical, so you need to have a uniform spray coverage as much as possible. Activation is required, meaning that the herbicide doesn't need to stay at the surface of the soil. This herbicide needs to move into the first few inches of the soil to be really efficient, meaning that you need to get water. When you apply the pre-emergence herbicide, you probably need to get water in the next 5 to 7, 10 days after application. You need at least half an inch of water to make sure that the herbicide is penetrating into the ground and is really efficient. If it just starts at the surface of the ground, it will start to degrade because of UV light, and it will not be active. Make sure that you're not disturbing the ground after applying this pre-emergence herbicide, because any disturbance will be an open area for weeds to emerge. And as I mentioned earlier, when you are using drip irrigation, you may reduce the length of residual control over time because you're washing off the herbicide, you're increasing the wash off of this pre-emergence herbicide. So some pre-emergence herbicide that classify them depending on the kind of weeds that they are controlling. So these one are mostly pre-emergence herbicides that we are recommending for controlling grasses. So we have herbicides such as Allion, Dovrinol, Kerb, Solicam, Surflan, Velpar. Please note that Allion and Velpar are also good for annual broadleaf species, for dicots. They are not just good for grasses, they are also good for dicots. They are not so good on perennial grass, perennial weeds, but they are really great herbicide for annual weeds. I had Gallery here in New Jersey, but I realized it's not labeled for use in New York, so do not apply Gallery in New York at all. Same classification, but this time looking at broadleaf species, the dicots. We have herbicides such as Callisto, Cazeron, Chateau, Carmex, Princeps, Sinbar, Solida. We are not using a lot of Sinbar here in New Jersey, mostly because in our sandy soil, it can be extremely detrimental to the plant. We can have a lot of phytotoxicity, especially if you're using a high rate of Sinbar. So growers do not tend to use Sinbar a lot here in New Jersey. A lot of growers are using Carmex and Princep and will mix it with one of the grass herbicide, Solicam most of the time, or eventually Dovrinol. A note that I didn't get, but Surflan, which is a grass, pre-emergent grass herbicide, doesn't seem to be available in 2022, maybe not before 2023, we'll have Surflan available again. Looking at some of these herbicides, so that was an experimentation we conducted at the Marucci Center for 3 years. So you're looking at an untreated block where you can see a lot of grasses, a lot of sedges on some goldenrod, which is a perennial weed. So we used Allion in fall, the previous year, and you're looking at the data in July of the following year. And we still had, Allion was really great, even if you applied it the previous fall, except for sedge control. So what you see green in the Allion picture are really sedges. Cazeron was a great pre-emergence herbicide when applied in fall, but I would not think, I think Allion is still doing a better job, especially for grasses compared to Cazeron. Our best results were really when we're using a three-way mix of Carmex, Callisto, and Surflan applied in spring. That's where we got the best result in terms of weed control, especially looking at sedge control, which is a big problem at the station. We really got excellent result mixing these three herbicides together, mostly because when you're mixing Carmex, which is a photosystem 2 herbicide, on Callisto, which is an H3PD herbicide, you're getting some synergistic activity when you're mixing the two together. So they're really great for broadleaf and sedge control. And when you're adding Surflan to the mix or a different grass herbicide, you're really getting good control of grasses as well. A quick update on some things that happened with herbicide in 2017. So we observed a lot of injury on blueberry in 2017, looking at stunting, chlorosis, russeting of the fruit. That was a major problem for us in New Jersey. And when we look at what the growers were doing, we asked growers to provide the pesticide application records. Something that was spot on was that all the growers who got this kind of issue on their plant had applied pendimethalin, prowl herbicide in this field. On some of the problems that we had with pendimethalin that make this issue was that growers were using pendimethalin with late application with regard to crop phenology. So really important to apply pre-emergence herbicide before bud break. They were using the highest label rate, especially if you look at our soil texture in New Jersey. We have really sandy soil with low organic matter. So that's provide you the full shot of herbicide when you're applying the herbicide on the ground. On our blueberries have really a shallow root system. So that was kind of good recipe for getting issue, especially because we had such late application. On what pendimethalin is doing is that it's really an herbicide which is absorbed by the roots, and that will prevent the development of fine airy roots, fine feeding roots, if you want. So I took this picture, I dug up some plants, looking at plants that have been treated with pendimethalin and looking at plants that were not treated with pendimethalin. And clearly the picture really, is really impressive to see how pendimethalin really prune all the feeding roots out of the blueberry rooting system. So basically the symptoms that you are looking on the bush were mostly due to the fact that the plant was not able to feed right, mostly because we prune all this small feeding root when we are using pendimethalin. So this herbicide is not labeled anymore for use on blueberry, mostly because of these issues that we observed in 2017 in New Jersey. To last slide, so we're using post-emergence foliar herbicide as well. So a few recommendations looking at this post-emergence herbicide. Make sure you never let any non-selective herbicide in contact with green or living blueberry tissue. Make sure that if you have to use this non-selective herbicide, you can use protective shields around blueberry plants in new planting, because the new planting will be the most sensitive type of blueberry to this post-emergence non-selective herbicide. With post-emergence herbicide, the weed size matter. Weeds are best controlled when they're relatively small, so that's emphasize the need for scouting, really important. Be aware of herbicide resistance in some weed species. I know that for us in New Jersey, horseweed is really resistant to glyphosate, so we have difficulties controlling horseweed with glyphosate applied post-emergence. It will not do the job. Post-emergence herbicide may require spray tank additives such as surfactant to maximize control efficacy. That's mostly the case with graminicide, the herbicide that are targeting the grasses. On really optimal spray volumes and appropriate nozzle selection will be really important on vary among herbicides. So pay attention to the label when you're using some of these post-emergence herbicide. Is what we have labeled here in New Jersey. So we have the non-selective herbicides such as M and gramoxone, which are strictly contact herbicides. They have no systemic activities. They will not penetrate into the plant. Glyphosate it's a systemic herbicide by definition, really working great, not just on annual weeds, but also for perennial weeds as well. We have Rely as well, which has some local systemicity, great herbicide, but be careful with this glyphosate or Rely herbicide. If you have new canes, you really want to make sure that you're not applying this herbicide to the new canes, because that may be a perfect recipe for killing new canes on blueberry bushes. A few selective herbicides. So we have the graminicide, fusilade, post-select. They are really great for controlling annual grasses. We have Embed, which is a low volatility formulation of 2,4-D. We are just starting to use it here in New Jersey. I'm concerned again with potential injury to new canes. And the last one that I wanted to mention is Sandia. That's basically a workhorse for controlling yellow nutsedge, which is a big issue here in New Jersey, as I mentioned. Really, Sandia is doing a great job controlling nutsedge. Just to illustrate that, that's a trial we did in 2020. Looking at the untreated check, which is really loaded with yellow nutsedge, we used Sandia post-emergence when the yellow nutsedge was at the 2-leaf stage, 2 to 3-leaf stage, and we came back 45 days later with a second application of Sandia. Really by the end of the season, we had excellent control of yellow nutsedge. So that's really, I like this herbicide mostly for yellow nutsedge control because it's such a tremendous problem here in New Jersey. With that said, I don't know, Anya, if we still have time. That's my last slide. It's highbush blueberry weed management calendar schedule, and I think it can be used in other regions as well. So Anya, that was my presentation, and hopefully we still have a little bit of time if we have any questions from people.
Thank you so much. That was just so helpful. I'll definitely be watching the recording of this during the growing season. There
is a lot to cover on weed management. 30 minutes to talk about weed management in blueberry is you really have to compress it.
Thank you so much. And I think we don't have much time for questions now, but would you be able to look at the chat and answer any questions in the chat?
Yes, of course, no problem.
Thank you so much. That would be wonderful, because I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker, my wonderful colleague, Laura McDermott. Laura, are you there?
So hello, everyone. Thanks very much, Anya, for introducing us. Liz Malchoff and I are going to kind of co-present this, this topic. And I'm going to talk first about the actual water quality issues, and then Liz is going to handle the equipment issues. And we certainly will take, I don't think it'll take very much time, and we'll try to get through it so that we can answer questions. So first of all, and let me preface this, is that this comes from, you know, one of the greatest challenges for us in the Northeast, where we have just a whole slew of different soil types that we're trying to grow on, is that often our soil types are not perfect for blueberries. And so that makes the soil management a problem or a challenge. And then sometimes even the irrigation water can also be a bit of an issue. And that seems to be where we're finding some solutions to kind of languishing blueberry plantings that just don't have great vigor. And it seems like everything else is done right. And then we look at the water and it's like, holy cow, we really need to address this. So basically, the blueberries are in the Ericaceae family, the family of heaths, and they're true acid-loving plants. Your target soil pH is 4.5. We can go up to 5.0, and they still can perform pretty well, but 4.5 is our target. And ideally, they'd like, just like Thierry just was mentioning, a sandy, well-drained soil, preferably with a higher water table so they can get access to water as they grow. But that sandy soil is not always something that we have available to us. If you have higher organic matter soils, oddly enough, the pH can be a little bit higher, perhaps than 5.0. I've seen excellent plantings that the pH of the soil seems to be around 5.5, but I think maybe the way we're growing with lots of heavy mulch and the acidification of the soil as the mulch breaks down, that might actually be helping us to some degree. However, we cannot expect to grow a good, vigorous crop of blueberries, high bush blueberries, if we're on poorly drained or heavy soils, especially if the cation exchange capacity is high, it's 18 or above, or if your calcium levels are greater than 2,000 pounds per acre. This is not ideal blueberry soil. Having said that, I do have some growers that have been able to combat that high calcium levels and the high CEC levels, but it does take a lot of work. So when we see higher pH in the soil, we often see iron deficiencies, that yellowing, along with some other nutrient deficiencies. And sometimes we just see poor vigor, poor growth. We don't see a ton of other obvious foliar problems, but we just don't see good growth. And so pre-planning, getting that site ready, it could take 2 years. This is something that new growers do not want to hear because, as you all know, it takes quite a while before we get good growth out of a planting, and yield. But if you have to do 2 or so extra years in preparation, it's daunting, but it's still worth it. And I do want to point out that sometimes I can just tell, or at least get an idea of what our CEC is going to be just by looking at the soil. So a lot of times when we see light colored sands, we have really low cation exchange capacity. Could be even 3 to 5 milliequivalents per 100 grams of soil, and that's what we usually call it. So and then when we see maybe darker colored loams and silt loams, a lot of times we'll see CEC in the 15 to 25 range, milliequivalents per 100 grams. And organic soils like muck soils can often have CEC of 50 to 100. So that's a kind of breadth. And if we're looking at having an upper limit of about 18, that shows you that a lot of our soils may not be appropriate necessarily. The challenge is that sulfur is cheap and blueberry fruit is worth a lot of money. So people are really interested in growing blueberries on less than perfect soils. And this particular picture is not mine. It's actually from the University of Florida. I do not think, at least I hope, that is not elemental sulfur spread. I think it's probably mixed with something else. But the problem with applying sulfur to an existing planting is that we are really limited with how much sulfur can be spread because sulfur can burn plants. So that's again going back to why it's so important to get the site prepped ahead of time. So let's talk about the water, because if you have done everything right and you're working with that soil and you're trying your best to keep the soil pH in that 4.5 to 5.0 range, and you still are struggling with plant growth, and if you haven't tested your water before this, now's the time, because a lot of times we will have bicarbonates and carbonates in the water that can increase the salt concentration and also raise the pH of the water itself. And if your irrigation water is from a well, so you have a relatively consistent source as far as the water quality goes, that can be a real problem. This can decrease the nutrient availability. Most people have problems resulting in plugging of irrigation lines, calcification, just kind of jamming up those lines. If you're fertigating, you might notice this especially. And in extreme situations, you could see soil crusting. We don't see a lot of that, thank goodness, in our region, but certainly in the Southwest and the West, where they have alkaline soils, this is a common occurrence. And the only way you're going to be able to figure out if you've got an issue is to actually do water testing. So that really is important. You can do your own measurement aids, and this might at least give you some ballpark information about what your pH is. And some of these tools are just regular old pH strips. And sometimes people use pool strips. They can work and they're very helpful for giving you a ballpark. But I have noticed that the pool strips are very general. They don't really target, they don't really hone down into the kind of breadth of information that you need. So these color fast strips and are the zone that we're looking specifically for is the 4.0 to 7.0 pH range. You can get them at Sanitation Tools, probably some other suppliers carry them as well. And then some people rely on pH meters, which you can get very inexpensive ones or very fancy ones, but as long as you've got something that you know that are reliable. The problem with some of the meters is that you have to continue to recalibrate them, and that can be a real challenge for farmers. You just need to do that probably several times a season in making sure that they're calibrated. So here's an example of a little discussion about alkalinity. Alkalinity doesn't necessarily mean that your water is hard, although that sometimes is used interchangeably. But basically, it's the measure of the calcium carbonate and the buffering capacity. And so if you have low buffering capacity of less than 30 milligrams per liter of calcium carbonate, that means that you can easily adjust that pH of your sample. If you have higher than that, higher than 100 milligrams per liter, that means you have high pH water, which is also going to be really hard to adjust. So this is a nice little image from Penn State. Here we have a water sample that's 9.0 in both water sample A and B. On the left, the total alkalinity is 75 milligrams per liter. So that means that in order to drop that pH to where we want it to be, you have to add 10 drops of acid in order to drop it down to 7.0. Whereas if our alkalinity is only 25, we only have to have 1 drop of acid in order to drop that pH. So alkalinity is really important. If you don't know what your alkalinity is, you cannot adjust your irrigation water pH. And here's just another chart from Eric Smith at the University of Georgia that talks about these are upper limits. So this means these are the upper thresholds for when you just cannot tolerate anything more. We would prefer these amounts to be less. So it gives the electrical conductivity or the salinity that measure, which we haven't really talked about, but that's an important water quality measure. The total dissolved solids, which actually can play into the hardness, not necessarily alkalinity, but the hardness. And we want that. That's a fairly 250 to 640 parts per million. The pH, again, if your pH is of your water is over 6.0, then we want to do something about that. So measuring that is important. It also gives the upper limits of bicarbonates, of boron, which is not usually a problem. I've never seen it a problem in either surface water or well water. But if it's high, it can cause some problems, toxicity problems with plants. And then of course, chloride and sodium, which especially if you're using municipal water supplies, that occasionally can be an issue. The other thing to keep in mind is that surface water, which is stream or river or pond water, if you're using that for irrigation, that can vary wildly during the growing season. So kind of constantly measuring that to make sure that your water is where you think it is, especially if you're acidifying it, is going to be necessary. And then well water is it is usually more consistent. However, if we have droughts or if you have a shallow well, that can change too. Let's keep going. And so what kinds of acids do you need to use in order to neutralize water alkalinity? And these are the four most commonly used: phosphoric, sulfuric, nitric, and citric. They have different percent strengths. The cost is also different for these. Citric acid is quite a lot. Citric and nitric acid actually are quite a lot more expensive than phosphoric and sulfuric. Phosphoric and sulfuric. Sulfuric is usually the cheapest, but the relative hazard of that is quite high. You also, when you add acids, you also get some other nutrients that come into the system and into your fertility program. So you could get quite a lot of sulfur, quite a lot of phosphorus, quite a lot of nitrogen that come in depending upon what type of acid you use. Keeping in mind that acids are really dangerous, can be extremely dangerous. When you add acids to water, you create an enormous amount of heat. That heat can burn you, it can burn your eyes. So making sure that you have safety glasses, face shields, rubberized aprons, and then acid resistant gloves and boots when you are mixing this or working with the acid is really, really important. You want to use the correct equipment, and Liz will talk a little bit more about this, but containers and fittings that don't corrode or resist the acid. When you mix acid with water, you want to make sure that you add acid to the water, not vice versa. And you want to fill that stock container half full. Acid slowly is added, mixing well with trying to eliminate any splashes. And then you can continue to kind of add water to the diluted mixture as you go. And then fertilizers should go in after the acid, both behind the mixing and then incorporating them into that acidification as is appropriate. There are online calculators that are really helpful. The one that I've used most is from University of New Hampshire. It's called Calc, and you can just Google this, but that's the website right there. You need to know the pH of your sample, and you have to know the alkalinity of your sample. And you also have to know your target alkalinity, which for our purposes is about 1. We want the total bicarbonates to go below 1 milliequivalent per liter. So that's your target. And that's about it. I think we can add, let me just quickly look and see. I think those are all for Thierry. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. I'm going to advance this slide set for Liz, and I'll get Liz on here and she can talk a little bit more about the equipment.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm a drip irrigation designer, and I work with Empire Drip Supply, and I will buzz through this real quickly here. Typically, the injectors, so fertigation is injection of chemicals directly into your water line. Typically, that's going to be at a really low rate, 1 to 3%. And this is so that you can achieve more distribution uniformity across your system. That's a critical component of all these injectors. They all work in that smaller percentage. Next. So where does it go? This is a question that I get a lot from people. Typically, we like to put the fertigation system after the fertilizer or the filter, I apologize, and before the pressure regulator. We don't really like to send chemicals through pumps, through filters. We try to avoid that as much as possible. So we try to put the injector after all of the accoutrements that are prior to the system, and then before the pressure regulator, because you're going to have some pressure loss through the fertigation unit, and the pressure regulator is already set to what you want your system to be. So in order to maintain the desired pressure, you're going to want to put that before the pressure regulator. Next. There's 3 different types of injectors. There is the basic Venturi style, which basically has no moving parts. It uses some physics principles to increase the velocity and decrease the suction. There's water-driven pumps that actually use the water going through them to facilitate the sucking action. This is really important when your flow rates are changing. And then there's an electric one, and typically electric injectors are used with really high flow rates, typically over 100 gallons a minute. Just to go a little bit about the Venturi style fertigator, that typically is called, or the brand name is called Mozzie. It's kind of like Kleenex. There's really only one style of them out there. Like I said, it uses just some basic physics principles. It increases the velocity by coning down in the unit and increases the negative pressure zone to increase suction through a tube. So typically you'd put the tube right in your bucket of solution, and as the water is passing through it, it creates the suction action. This is really good for crops where you're trying to put X amount per acre on. The price range is a lot lower. You're looking at $145 to about $350, depending on the size of your unit. Next. This is a little bit more about the Mozzie unit, and I'm not going to go too much into this. Basically, there's a few components that you need in your system kind of tuned up to make it work, and it really works better if you've got a set acreage and you're not changing that and the flow rate is the same. The next are the water-driven pumps. Most popular, we sell a brand called Chemalizer. It is the workhorse of the water-driven pumps. It is a set ratio of 1%. You can alter what is being injected by changing the concentration of the solution in your bucket, so you can keep that in mind. Price range on this is about $365. This is really good for greenhouses, sensitive crops, and crops or areas where you're changing flow rate. You might have one section that's maybe a half acre, one section that's 2 acres, and you still want to maintain a consistent application rate. Next. The Superdose is also a water-driven pump. Dosematic or Dosatron is another common brand. This is an adjustable ratio. So typically they're going to be between 0.2 and 1% or between 1 and 2.5%, adjusting on 0.2 increments. These are definitely more expensive. They're going to range anywhere between $500 and $1,200. This is just giving you a little bit more fine tuning and what the amount you're actually injecting. Next. And lastly is the electric version of the fertigators. And this is, like I said, for a lot higher flow rates. We're usually doing these 100 gallons and up, where the traditional water-driven fertigators have some limitations. So these are size, you can go up to thousands of gallons a minute, but the cost is quite high. $1,500 to $3,500 is usually what you're looking at for an electric injector unit. They do not have wear parts like the other water-driven injectors do, but they're pretty affordable still. So you'd have to go through quite a bit of them before you'd want to upgrade to the electronic. And that's about it.
Thank you so much, Laura and Liz. This was so informative, and I just love learning from you. And I think Laura was going to say something, so I'll let you go ahead.
I'm not really saying anything. I was just gonna say thanks, Liz. And I also wanted to brag a little bit that Liz is the president of the Berry Growers Association in New York State. So it's been really great to work with her. And she also is the board director of the New York State Hort Society. And I didn't know this until I was putting the little thing together, but in 2021, she was chosen for the 40 Under 40 Award by the Fruit Growers News. So congratulations, Liz.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Laura.
So yeah, Anya, I think we are good. And unless we have questions.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Let's see. I don't think there are any questions in the chat yet. So folks, you are welcome to put those in if they come to mind, but let's proceed. Is there, I think, Liz, you wanted to say something, right? Would you like to go ahead?
Well, I'm gonna do the annual meeting here next. Laura, if you wanna share your screen over to me, I can pull up my PowerPoint.
Because the Berry Growers is an extremely important part of our berry outreach effort in New York State. So don't leave, but you could do your DEC thing if you'd like.
All right, thank you, Laura, for that setup. So again, I'm Liz Malchoff. Besides designing irrigation systems, I'm also the chair of the New York State Berry Growers Association. I've held this position for the last few years now, and I'm just gonna go ahead and give you guys a review of what we've done in 2021. 2021 was quite difficult for us. Besides all the challenges with COVID, we lost Paul Baker, and that has been really impactful. He guided us quite a bit in our direction, and so we definitely are going to be missing him. The good news is that we have a new interim executive director. His name is Jim Bittner. Some of you may be familiar with him already. He runs a 400-acre fruit farm in Appleton on the west side of the state with his two sons, Kevin and David. Jim's been working really closely with Grow New York Farms, who's been the organization that's spearheading the new farm labor reform. He says there are many facets to this organization. Oops, apologize, and I can't see it because of the thing. There are many facets to this organization. We facilitate communication between farmers and researchers through our Fruit Quarterly. We keep farmers appraised of regulatory issues that could affect our ability to farm. And thirdly, we work with other agricultural organizations to ensure that we understand and appreciate the challenges we all face. I'm excited to work with people I've known for decades in this new capacity. One of the most important things that is affecting a lot of growers, especially growers with employees, is the new Farm Labor Wage Act that was put through last year. We really are asking for everyone to, if they are able to, sign up to participate in the testimonies and the hearings. They have done 3 additional wage board hearings, and there are 2 more remaining. The first one is January 18th, and the second one is January 20th. We encourage anyone that can and is willing to speak at this hearing, and you can sign up at this link that's provided here. We also have that on our website. Grow New York Farms has a toolkit that will help with your testimony, and we can also help you with talking points. So please don't hesitate to reach out. This is very important. Our funding for 2021. The good news is that we received our $260,000 for research. We were in the governor's budget for the second time. We also received our $60,000 for our organizational initiatives. We also, thankfully, received the 20% that was withheld from our last year's budget, which came just in the nick of time. We were basically running out of money. We were then able to reinstate the operations back to the pre-budget cut levels. We can't do the in-person lobbying like we've done in the past years, so we're going to be doing it virtually, and that's going to be coming up here soon in later January, early February. As always, membership is critical to maintain this funding. Part of our funding, we work with Juliet Carroll on a SWD monitoring network. She coordinated with a few other extension specialists and growers in New York, And what was interesting is we normally see emergence of SWD in early June. A lot of the traps were showing emergence in late June and early July, which was different than in the years past. So more research is going to be conducted to figure out what caused this, either climate, weather effects, emerging natural enemies, or some of our spray programs that we've been doing to combat SWD. The sticky cards were really successful. And you can see in the top right corner here, the heat map basically of where the emergence were in the counties that were being monitored. You can see a lot of them say June, but like I said, that was late June. And there's quite a few more July than we had seen in the past. This information was entered into the Ag Pest Monitor, but it's also being distributed through our blog. So if you guys haven't already signed up for our blog, I highly encourage you to do so. It is free. We sent out 32 posts this past season. Now this is during the season and the height of everything, where we're keeping you up to date on the current numbers and that we're seeing throughout the state. So this has been very helpful to many growers. Our funding also supports our Western New York berry specialist position, who you are already familiar with now. So welcome Anya to our team. I'm sure she already gave a little bit about herself, but she worked closely with Dr. Marvin Pritz in her post-grad work, and that's kind of where her name kind of came into the loop, and we're really happy to have her on board. She's hit the ground running. She actually held a strawberry workshop this fall, I apologize, at Wagner Bees and Produce in Fillmore. On top of a planting tour and harvest demonstration, she also discussed weed control, fall troubleshooting, fertility management, and winter mulch application, which are all questions that we get constantly. You can contact her through her email here listed, or you can contact us or reach out through our berry growers. She also is co-hosting with Laura McDermott office berry hours, and that happens every Thursday from 12:30 to 1:30. Please feel free to join and ask a question or just listen. You can find the link through the Eastern New York Extension website. I just want to briefly talk about some of our research initiatives. Some of these are just some highlights. We've been really focusing on SWD management. So we're trying to improve the adult monitoring by finding more selective attractants for SWD. And they're doing this by looking at different bacteria and yeasts that SWD seem to fancy. And then using that information, we're testing attract and kill technologies for controlling SWD. We also are looking at the efficacy of applying chemical controls below the canopy. We found that we can conserve some beneficial insects by targeting SWD on the ground specifically. And we're really looking at implications for the chemical controls on beneficial arthropods. We're also looking at a parasitoid wasp, and this has been a really long ongoing project, and we finally are receiving some larvae at the Cornell with the Cornell research team, and they're going to be rearing those for a hopeful release this summer. I'm sure Anya is going to go into this some more. Her and Dr. Pritz were growing berries using different inputs, and they found that the biggest factor on flavor ended up being temperature. The greater changes in the cold during the night and the warm during the day caused the berry to be more sweet. They also are looking at different colored shade cloth on low tunnel berries, and they're finding that keeping the berries slightly cooler during the hotter temperatures of the summer is also proving to provide better yields. We got our berry pricing survey done last year, which was published in our newsletters. This is a survey we do every 5 years just to kind of get a handle on what the prices are for various berries being grown in various parts of the state. And a future project is we're going to be taking surveys of the increased costs that are happening due to our labor shortage issues, and what the minimum wage increase is going to have on our small farms. We're actually going to be doing these in person so we can get a lot more detailed data instead of just like a traditional paper survey. Dr. Courtney Weber has been working on some promising blackberry primocanes and that have an earlier fruiting time and a few varieties of red raspberries. And he specifically is looking for growers who are going to be willing to plant some trial varieties this upcoming season. So if that's something that you're interested in, please reach out to me or to Dr. Weber directly, and we can get you involved in that. Last, I'd like to talk about our netted blueberries demo plot. This was an ongoing project. There were 2 completely covered netted blueberry high tunnel plots, or not high tunnel, high bush, that were done at Dale Isla Riggs Place in Stephentown, New York, and Abers Acres in Kennedy. I'm just going to leave this up just so you can see these pictures here a little bit. This is the Dale Isla Riggs plot in Stephentown, New York. We held an open house at both of these locations in the fall. So growers were able to come out, look at the setups, ask the professionals the questions on the installation. These are going to be open for growers, so we're going to be having more chances to go visit those in person in the future. So keep an eye out for that. And we're also going to be updating some YouTube educational videos and fact sheets on that. So that is going to be following this. We also set some SWD traps on the inside and the outside of the netting just to prove the efficacy. And as expected, we had a 0% infestation rate under the netting. So the netting really works. It's expensive, but it's showing really promising results. And lastly, I just want to make a plug on why our membership is so important. With these uncertain times, we need membership numbers to strengthen our voice. The greater the number, the greater the impact on the constituents, and that's what legislators want, and that's what's going to get us to stay in our budget. Our research and development wouldn't exist without our state funding, so all the information that you're hearing today and in the future, that most of that is coming from some type of state funding. So we encourage your friends and colleagues to join in and maintain a membership. The benefits of membership, we have that monthly subscription of our newsletter. That's our biggest thing. We send out all the information from these researchers that's developed. We send that to you in real time. It doesn't need to be published officially. We send it out as it's hitting, as the information is developing. So you're first to know on new emerging information with that. You also get a quarterly subscription to the Fruit Quarterly. And that is the Hort Society publication that is much bigger. It's usually 30 to 40 pages, real in-depth scientific results. You're also getting that with our membership. We give you SWD alerts, both with a postcard and an email. That's sent directly to your address. So even if you're not on the blog, we're still proactively trying to get that information out to you. You get a free 1-hour social media consultation with our communications director, Robin. She's really awesome. She knows a lot of stuff. We get a listing on our Find a Farm directory, free promotion of the berry industry through our social media platforms, and representation with New York State. All are very important. So thank you for taking the time to listen to me here. And if you have any other questions on the things we're doing or any other suggestions on where you think we should go or research objectives that you think we should start to explore, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're also looking for a new board member. So if you know someone that it would be interested in serving on the board, we would love to have them. They don't have to be a berry grower specifically, but it's always welcomed. And with that, I will pass it back to Anya.
Thank you so much, Liz. Yeah, whenever I hear about what the Berry Growers Association does, I'm just always floored. You have such a long list of really valuable and important work, and you collaborate so closely with so many different people, with Cornell University, with legislators. Thank you so much for taking the time to just introduce everyone in the meeting or refresh everyone here about everything that you do. So with that, I think now would be a really good time for us to break for lunch.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.